Hello. I want to welcome everyone to this RDA Fair Data Maturity Model Work Group webinar, which is the Aligning International Initiatives for Promoting and Assessing Fair Data. I am very excited about this. I'm hoping that everyone else will get a lot out of it. My name is Stephanie Hagstrom, and I'm the Director of Community Development at RDA US. And RDA US is a national node of RDA Global, and we're dedicated to the goal of building a social and technical infrastructure to enable open sharing and reuse of data. I'm very excited about today's webinar, and I want to thank Shelley, Keith, and Edith for bringing this to the RDA US and giving us the agencies, US agencies and EU institutions an opportunity to share about fair data implementation. I think, we're not sure, but we think this might be the first time that multiple US agencies along with the EU are together to share about what they've been doing on fair data implementation. So it's very exciting, really great lineup today. I want to go over just quickly, spend just a couple minutes on some housekeeping, and then we'll get started. Today's webinar schedule, we have a brief overview of the Fair Data Maturity Model, which will be given by the working group members. Then we have 10-minute presentations, one right after another. We're not going to do Q&A at the end of each talk. We will introduce each talk, and then at the end, we've set aside time for questions and answers. A little bit of housekeeping. If for some reason you lose your internet and you can't get on, there is an option to dial in to the telephone. This is the email that I received from the system. It's the one you used to dial in this morning. There's a section on how to use the telephone, so you might want to get that up on your screen in case you lose connection. That's how you'll join in. So at the end, as I mentioned, we will have a panel questions and answers, and there is an option. There's this box on the right-hand side of your screen that where you can type your questions. So it's right over here. And since we have many panelists and we're going to do questions at the end, if you have specific questions for any specific panelists, I suggest you put their name or who you want to direct that question to. Otherwise, we have people who will be monitoring those and bringing the questions back to the panel to answer, and we'll do the best we can with the time we have. I also wanted to note that this event is being recorded, and that includes the question and answers. And this will be uploaded to the RDA website at some point. Not sure when. Okay, so that was it for me. I want to, at this point, get started, and I'm going to turn this over to Keith, who's going to go over the RDA Fair Data Maturity Model.
Thanks, Stephanie. So my name is Keith Russell. I am one of the three co-chairs of the Research Data Alliance Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group, and I'm very happy to be joined by Edith Herzog and Shelley Stahl, my fellow chairs in this working group. So first, I'd like to give you a very brief overview of the working group and what we have done to set a bit of perspective to start off this event. So next slide, please, Stephanie.
Having trouble. Oh, there we go.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So to cast our mind back a little, when the FAIR principles were originally drafted back in 2014 and then 2016, the article in Nature came out. One of the things that underlies the fair data principles is that they are principles, and therefore they are not terribly strict. So when interpreting that and taking that further, we noticed that there was quite a lot of ambiguity in the way they were translated into practice. So that resulted in a wide range of interpretations. That in turn resulted in a lot of organizations going out there, including, in fact, my own here in Australia, and drafting different assessment frameworks to assess how fair data was. So looking at all these different assessment frameworks, you said, well, actually, these different assessment frameworks would use different metrics. It would be impossible to compare the results, and it'd be impossible to benchmark what is properly fair data and what is not. So we said, well, it would actually be worthwhile bringing together a working group and through that working group, bringing together a whole range of stakeholders from around the globe to build on those existing approaches and expertise to come up with a set of core assessment criteria for fairness. And that was resulting from that fair data maturity model and a tool set that people could use, and a fair data checklist, and that would finally be released as an RDA recommendation. So next slide, please.
I'm having trouble with this for some reason.
Just a few things we were sort of out of scope for us. We didn't want to develop yet another evaluation method. It was much more intended to be a common language across existing evaluation approaches. It would also not define how the core criteria needed to be evaluated. There was space there for it to be picked up by different players and used in different ways. And also, we definitely did not want to revise and redesign the FAIR principles. We set them as a fixed thing. Stephanie, next slide, please. So just a very brief history of the working group. Established in 2019, started off with a landscaping exercise, bringing together all the publicly available fair assessment tools and methodologies, and then building on that, we came up with a draft set of indicators, and then we sort of did a number of iterations based on those indicators. We're using community feedback and community input from around the globe. Next slide, please. And in this year, we've actually got to the point where we were able to test those indicators against data sets and methodologies, and we have adoption from different players, and we'll be hearing more from that in a second. And it was released as an actual RDA formal recommendation. So we are now turning into a maintenance mode and looking into maintenance and governance experts. And one of the things we're now also just undertaken is a survey to bridge the gap between the funders and communities on the understanding of fair assessments and what the value is of fair assessments, but also what the considerations are when using a fair assessment. Next slide, please. So these are a few of our key outputs. Obviously, the fair maturity model, the fair data maturity model, which you can find linked there, a report from the European Open Science Cloud Synergy project, and a publication that was released in the Data Science Journal. So those are a few of the key outputs that are probably worth keeping in mind. So next slide, please. So that was a very quick overview of the Fair Data Maturity Model working group and the outputs that we have delivered. I would also like to recognize and really thank the editorial team that helped us in this process, and that was a really valuable asset. And thank you to the European Commission for providing support to that team, because they made it possible to bring together all of those different opinions, and that resulted in a set of recommendations. So now I'd like to hand over to one of the case studies, one of the cases in which our maturity model has been adopted. So this is by the European Open Science Cloud FAIR Working Group, and I would like to hand over to Sarah Jones. So Sarah Jones is chair of this the FAIR Working Group and the new European Open Science Cloud Engagement Manager at GEON. And she will be presenting with Oya Bern, who is a researcher at the Fraunhofer Institute of Applied Information Technology. So Sarah and Oya, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much. So just to check you can hear okay, I think so. So if you go to the next slide, please. I'm going to begin by just giving you a brief history of EOSC and the background context, and then we'll talk about, well, Oya will talk about how we've taken the FAIR metrics. So EOSC, for anyone who's not familiar, is the European Open Science Cloud, and there's been a lot of work that's happened over the last kind of 5 or so years, lots of investment by the European Commission. So it's like 600 million that's been invested in 2014 to 2020 in various projects to build EOSC. And there's been a lot of work essentially to set up that framework. So lots of council conclusions, lots of different expert groups looking at things like fair data and looking at the cloud and how we should be configuring everything. So there's a lot of work that's kind of gone into this. If you can move to the next slide. I wanted to just kind of explain what EOSC is, because I think it can be quite a nebulous concept. So effectively, we've described EOSC now as a web of fair data and services. And what we're trying to do is federate the different e-infrastructures and research infrastructures. So you can see here, we've got the kind of EOSC core, which is all of the basic services you need to make EOSC function, and then we're federating the data, and we have this kind of exchange or marketplace of services. And effectively what we're doing is providing an environment in which you can bring the data together and then perform your analysis on that. And it's the idea is to bring together all the data so that you're able to do more, we're able to address those societal challenges. If you click to the next slide. EOSC itself is part of many bigger initiatives. So the European Commission has a number of partnerships that have been created, and it also has this concept of various data spaces in different domains. And EOSC is really like a horizontal that cross-cuts across these. So it's relevant to, you know, the Green Deal, to agriculture, to lots of different research domains. Next slide, please. One of the kind of fundamental backgrounds is that we want to enable multidisciplinary discovery and reuse. So at the moment, the state of play for many researchers is that they have different services, different repositories they may go to find relevant data. It's not possible, well, there's more work needed to search across those and to bring that data together. So we want to try and connect up these different silos to have a very federated approach to the infrastructure, really so that it's providing a lot more added value to researchers. And I think these aims are quite similar across not just EOSC, but other research commons initiatives in different continents or different spaces. So the next slide. One thing I wanted to flag before I hand over to Oya, you'll see that EOSC has the word open in its title. We have extended to include the concept of fair, which is not exactly the same as open. There are overlaps between them, as you can see in the diagram below. But within the European Open Science Cloud, we're pushing for things to be as open as necessary, but we accept that some things need to be closed, some data can't be shared. And what we've brought in with this element of FAIR is that we're encouraging the use of standards. We have an EOSC interoperability framework, and that's really to set the baseline rules so that we can combine and reuse content in different contexts. And then the final slide from me is really talking about the FAIR working group that Keith mentioned I chair. We have 4 task forces in that group. We've been looking at FAIR practice across different disciplines, and there's a report with recommendations on how we help the disciplines adopt FAIR. We've also been developing the EOSC interoperability framework and the PID policy. Again, you can see links to these outputs. And the aspect that's most relevant to this discussion today is the metrics and certification task force. And we've been looking at the work from the RDA group and adopting that and devising a set of metrics to apply within the EOSC context. And that's what Oya is going to talk you through just now to explain where our work's at and the recommendations we would have for adoption.
Thank you. Yes, the EOSC FAIR task group, we just published a report on FAIR metrics for EOSC. What we did in this work, we analyzed ongoing activities about FAIR metrics, both from RDA and also main European projects such as FAIR is FAIR and other projects. We come up with a set of recommendations, 7 recommendations for the definition and implementation of metrics in the EOSC context. Our report includes a proposed set of metrics with timelines based on this RDA metrics, and also priorities for the future work. So where are the gaps? What are the potential opportunities for extension in this RDA work and adapted EOS FAIR metrics? Next slide, please. Our approach is quite a community-driven approach. For our task group at EOS, communities have a really key role. When we look to this FAIR practices, there is no common standards, data formats covering all these different disciplines at the granular level. So having this community-based approach will provide us a way of maturing these metrics. In here, like research communities, one of our recommendations, research communities should be supported to develop their own metrics based on this RDA maturity model. And also we should establish feedback mechanisms. Initially, we recommended that metrics should be reviewed after 2 years initially, then every 3 years to reflect the priorities of the communities. Next slide, please. Inclusive is another important point for us. Like, we should take the diversity across different communities. Some communities are well developed in their FAIR practices, others are lagging behind. And also another important point, that's some of the communities already have well-established practices, solutions, services. They are serving their own community needs, and then adapting additional requirements will take time and investment for them. So we should be aware of that, and we should acknowledge that this will be a gradual improvement, and evaluation methods also should reflect that gradual improvement. Fair assessment methods should not be only pass on and fail, like should guide those communities and recognize this progress in these communities. There can be also different fair assessment metrics for different stages of life cycle. And one of the important points is avoiding biases. Therefore, broad testing and validation with different domains are important. In the development activities, sometimes communities who already have practices might lead these activities, but testing with all these different communities and revising, avoiding these biases are important. Next, please. Third important point, not reinventing the wheel. Communities also should take RDA FAIR data maturity model as a starting toolbox. Then, based on their requirements, priorities can change, and there might be a step progressive approach. We already defined a set of metrics, but still extensive testing of this metrics is required. Then proposed revisions should be discussed in RDA groups, such as RDA working group and RDA data maturity model. Also, there is another point, FAIR metrics for other digital objects, such as software. That should be developed together with RDA Force 11 and RESA FAIR for software working group. Last point, like focusing on implementation, we need more, like as a communities, they need more guidelines with examples, and developing these guidelines and examples should be prioritized. Next, please. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, thank you, Sarah and Oya. So if you have any questions to any of the speakers today, please put them in either in the question box or in the chat, and we will address them at the end of all of the presentations. So I would like to move on to the next presentation, which is going to be delivered by Carlos Kasaran and Costas Rapanas, and they are both policy officers in the Open Science Unit at the Directorate General for Research and Innovation of the European Commission. So Carlos, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Keith. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Well, good morning, everybody. Afternoon, evening, depending on your corresponding time zone. My name is Carlos Kasaran. I'm a policy officer at the European Commission at the Open Science Unit. Allow me to start by thanking the organizers for giving us the chance of coming all together and discussing these very relevant issues related to FAIR. And I'm sure that the discussion that will ensue will be very interesting. Next slide, please. Thank you. A bit of introduction from our side. So open science represents an effective policy solution to overcome many of the problems that are brought about by an overabundance of data. And open science for us is all about the wide and early sharing of knowledge and tools. And it holds the key to improving the quality, the efficiency, and the creativity of research, as well as the trust by society and science. So I'm not going to preach to the choir here and convince you all about the benefits of open science, because I'm sure that we're all on the same page here. So let me just say that when it comes to the implementation of this open science policy, the Commission wears multiple hats. And the one that I'm going to be concentrating on today is our role as a research funder. Next slide, please. The Commission has been promoting open science in a stepwise approach through pilots and requirements since early in 2008, generating traction one step at a time. And I think that the key message here is that we would like for this positive trend to continue, which is why under the next framework program for research and innovation, Horizon Europe, we will likely see a much more holistic embedding of open science, and this will include elements of open access, research data management, and elements of citizen engagement. And this will happen at different levels of the implementation. So we're talking here about the evaluation of proposals through the grant agreements, and also during the lifetime of the projects themselves through the reporting on these projects. So with respect to publications, even though that's not the main focus of this talk, I would simply like to say that we're likely to see more stringent conditions related to open access. And when it comes to research data management, the Commission will require what we call responsible research data management in line with the FAIR principles. And I'll try and explain exactly what it is that I mean by this. Next slide, please. So with respect to the level of openness, the guiding principle will be as open as possible, as close as necessary. And we're likely to see some significant changes with respect to what we had under the previous framework program. So a big change is that now we will be requiring all projects that generate, collect, or reuse research data to set up and maintain a data management plan. And we would like for this DMP to be a machine actionable living document that gets updated during the lifetime of the project. We will also be requiring that data be deposited in a trusted repository. And this means that repositories will have to meet certain criteria in line with FAIR. And this is likely to include critical elements such as the provision of persistent identifiers to ensure minimal levels of richness with respect to metadata and so on. And I'd like to mention at this point that until we have a better means of explicitly measuring the fairness of data, trusted repositories are going to play a major role as a proxy for us to be confident that the data that is produced through our projects satisfies a certain degree of fairness. And finally, we would also like to encourage data to be open wherever possible, and this will be done through the provision of the appropriate licenses. Next slide, please. So data and publications are obviously not the only research outputs, and we also want that other outputs are also adequately managed. And we would like to see all of these outputs make it onto the data management plans, and where possible, open access to be granted to them. This will be of relevance for special types of outputs, such as software or other types of outputs, and will help in general to raise their visibility as first-class research outputs alongside data and publications. So we'd like for all of these other research outputs to also be fair, and this will probably require an extension of what we understand by fair for these specific outputs. And this will mean moving beyond data to understand what fairness means. And we're aware of several initiatives within the RDA, but also beyond, such as in the Research Software Alliance. And this is something that we're very interested in. So a better understanding of how to apply FAIR to these kinds of outputs will probably inform future funder requirements aimed at maximizing the impact of new research by facilitating the reuse of previous research. Next slide, please. So I'd like to briefly share with you a practical use case of FAIR in action. And this is the European COVID-19 data platform. This is being steered by us at the European Commission and implemented by our colleagues at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory and at the research infrastructure Elixir, as well as through other partners. And the platform is being developed under the umbrella of the European Open Science Cloud, which, as was explained, is an ecosystem of federated research infrastructures. And it represents the value of fair data sharing in the context of a health pandemic. So the platform allows for the quick and wide sharing, the reuse, the processing of, and the access to relevant research data and metadata. And I'd like to mention that this is actually quite an international endeavor. And in fact, many of the data that is currently flowing into the platform does so from the US, from Japan, through the INSDC collaboration. So this is already a very nice use case of FAIR in action and all the benefits that come together with FAIR data sharing. Next slide, please. So the Commission has also been very engaged in promoting fairness through relevant actions other than the data platform. And in the context of this pandemic, we drafted very early on detailed guidelines to our projects to be able to provide actionable guidance on FAIR, on open access to publications and data, best practices related to data management and DMPs. And these were all very well received by our research community. In addition, through our very tight and good collaborations with the Research Data Alliance, we were able to request that the RDA quickly set up an emergency working group on COVID-19. And this working group delivered detailed guidelines addressing data sharing, as well as legal and ethical considerations for the different types of data that were relevant in order to tackle the first stages of the pandemic. Now, finally, we work with many other partners, including OpenAir, who has developed an aggregating gateway through which to also provide access to publications, data, and other relevant outputs. Next slide, please. So we all agree that FAIR is great, fantastic. So what's next? We're in a situation right now where globally, we're all increasingly familiar with the FAIR principles, and we're all convinced about the positive impact that they have on enhancing the quality and the transparency of the scientific practice, as well as on many other aspects. So there is a need to mainstream FAIR practices across all scientific communities, and funders are key players in making this happen. Through funder requirements, funders in Europe and beyond create expectations, they raise awareness, and they encourage the uptake of the FAIR principles across grantees. So one of the obstacles that we've encountered in this process is the evidence scarcity of comprehensive and comparable evaluation mechanisms for what have mostly been more or less abstract requirements. And we believe that a first step towards bringing measurability and concreteness is the work that has been accomplished under the Fair Data Maturity Model Working Group of the RDA. And another very interesting initiative that merits being mentioned is this Fairware initiative that has been promoted by a group of funders, Wellcome Trust among them. So let me briefly, quickly say a few words about each of these initiatives. Next slide, please. So no need to go into what the Fair Data Maturity Model has done, because this has already been covered. Let me briefly attract your attention to this paper that was recently published with the working group chairs and the editorial board. And this includes a nice summary of all the work done within the working group and the outputs that have been produced. And we see that these outputs are actually the foundations on which assessment and evaluation methodologies can then be built. And we see that these methodologies actually have two very important purposes. First, there's the educational angle, in which we need to allow researchers to be able to gauge the level of fairness of their own outputs and help them to raise the bar. And then there's the element of having a compliance mechanism through which funders can actually verify whether requirements with respect to fairness are being met. And the idea, of course, is not to punish anybody or to leave communities behind, but to have an objective and comparable way of assessing how fair research outputs are and what the uptake of fairness is. So on this last point, it might be interesting to mention that there is quite clearly a demand for such mechanisms among funders. We're interested as the European Commission, and so are other funders, such as the Flemish community, for instance, here in Belgium, who are also interested in making use of these indicators to help them drive their promotion of the FAIR principles. Next slide, please. Finally, this Fairware initiative that I mentioned is also very pertinent, and this is led by the Research on Research Institute and backed by a number of funders, including the Wellcome Trust. And the goal of this initiative is to be able to develop new open software tools, including automatic fairness evaluation tools. And Fair is Fair, a Horizon 2020 project, is going to be quite active in this initiative. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Fair is Fair, this is a European project that aims at mainstreaming FAIR across different communities. So Fair is Fair is a key player in all FAIR-related aspects here in Europe and beyond. So their involvement in this initiative ensures that work will continue to build on existing work rather than happen in isolation. So this is very good news, and this is an initiative definitely to keep track of. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, FAIR data is definitely the cornerstone of any open science policy. It's definitely the cornerstone of our open science policy. And we plan to increase awareness of FAIR through the requirements that we set. And these will focus on, as I said, responsible research data management in line with FAIR. We're fully supportive of community-backed work, such as the FAIR data maturity model indicators or initiatives such as Fairware. And we see them as paving the way for meaningful evaluation and assessment mechanisms. And mainstreaming FAIR evaluation, either directly by us as funders or through repository requirements, can only lead to increased awareness and therefore result in a higher uptake of the FAIR principles across the board. So on that note, I'd like to finish and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Carlos. That was fantastic. Carlos and Costas have been incredibly supportive of the working group and promoting our outcomes. So I've been very quickly trying to post all of the citations for what's been talked about within the chat. And for our speakers, we do have some questions for you already for those who have already spoken. So if you could take a look at the questions, that would be fantastic. So now we refocus from Europe over to the US, and there's a number of initiatives implementing FAIR and data management practices agencies. And our next speaker comes from the US Geologic Survey, and this is Viv Hutchinson, who is the branch chief for the Science Data Management and Science Analytics and Synthesis Program. And her colleague, Fran Lightsum, who is our architect for the FAIR roadmap, and also the project manager, Herding Cats. And full disclosure, I am on that team, and I have been incredibly excited about the work they're doing. And I do believe this is their first time sharing it outside of USGS. So I'm incredibly excited that the progress is far enough to share that. So Viv and Fran, take it away.
Thank you, Shelley. The U.S. Geological Survey FAIR Roadmap Project is recommending ways to improve the maturity of our organization's processes for producing scientific research products that are consistent with FAIR principles. Could we go back? Previous slide, please. Thank you. I want to thank the project team, Viv Hutchison, Linda DeBrewer, Natalie Latish, and especially our external partners, David Gavani, who's an emeritus, Shelley Stahl, that you know, and Wade Bishop of the University of Tennessee. I also would like to thank the USGS Community for Data Integration for supporting our work. Next slide, please. The U.S. Geological Survey is a scientific organization in the Department of the Interior within the U.S. federal government. We do scientific research in-house, and we fund a smaller amount of external research. Our research is organized into 33 programs in 5 mission areas, which illustrate the diversity of our work: core science systems, ecosystems, energy and minerals, natural hazards, and water resources. The mission areas and programs support at least 9 different data repositories and 3 national data services. Research work is managed by 12 regions overseeing about 65 science centers, which in turn host hundreds of research projects. Scientists manage individual research projects that produce and publish data with review and approval by their science centers. These are largely observational data, but also include laboratory and computational results. USGS headquarters also manages policies and support services for the whole USGS that will be important in enabling fair maturity. Next slide. Viv and I are leading a small project funded by the USGS Community for Data Integration, which is a community of practice working to grow USGS knowledge and capacity in scientific data and information management and integration. The purpose of our project is recommending actions to enable the diverse set of USGS research projects to produce digital products that have greater fair maturity. We started with a survey of data producers and a call for use cases, specifically research projects that rely on finding, accessing, interoperating, and reusing data. In September 2019, we hosted a workshop that brought together 28 people for 3 days to immerse ourselves in the FAIR principles, analyze use cases, and discuss the roles of data producers, data storage and catalogs, value-added services, and policymakers. Throughout our discussions was recognition that open science requires the extension of the FAIR principles beyond data to include physical samples, research methods, software, and tools. In the end, the workshop produced 87 discrete recommendations. Workshop participants focused on how USGS can support research teams in creating fair data, metadata, and other scientific products, and also support enterprise systems that maintain the product's fairness. Next slide. The 87 recommendations are fairly evenly divided among those that address finding, accessing, interoperating, reusing, and a 5th group of actions that touch on all 4 FAIR principles. We call those cross-cutting. Next slide. Different parts of USGS would have responsibility for implementing the recommendations. 25 recommendations request actions from the USGS Community for Data Integration. One of these recommendations asks this community of practice to create a coordinating council that includes representatives from the other groups that are responsible for recommendations. This was a successful technique when USGS had 6 months to implement its mandatory open access plan back in 2016. We think it is good to learn from what works. In addition to serving as a sounding board for evaluating priorities and methods, the new USGS FAIR team is asked to address 11 recommendations of its own. 21 recommendations request actions from the core science systems mission area which is comprised of several programs that support information services, including the USGS Library, the official USGS Science Data Catalog, the Science-Based Data Repository, topographic and geologic mapping, curation of data from satellites, and preservation of physical samples and cores. 18 recommendations request actions from the USGS Committee that oversees policies and guidance that clarify how USGS science is carried out and how the resulting information products, which include maps, imagery, and publications, are developed, reviewed, approved, and published. Other recommendations request actions from USGS management, USGS repositories, and support offices like Human Resources, Information Technology, and Public Communication. Next slide. New technical capabilities are the focus of 56 recommendations. Implementing these capabilities will require different groups to take related actions, which are detailed in separate recommendations. One approach addresses the current situation of USGS metadata that assumes human readers. 20 recommendations will assist USGS researchers in producing metadata that is more consistent in how it provides information, so that it works better for automated use. A group of 18 recommendations will enable 12 independent USGS repositories and data systems to integrate into a consistent platform for finding and access. For example, one of our recommendations requests funding and staffing for USGS repositories to become trusted digital repositories. There are 7 recommendations for implementing tools and services to improve machine accessibility of USGS vocabularies and also assist data producers in using standard vocabularies and metadata. A group of 6 recommendations asks USGS to implement policies, tools, and services that enable data producers to use persistent identifiers that support the FAIR principles. Some of our most requested data is more than 50 years old. We have 3 recommendations to assist programs and science centers in making the older data FAIR. Some of our most important data is produced and then quickly used to respond to emergencies. 2 recommendations will prepare policies and standard operating procedures to enable that near real-time data to be FAIR. Next slide. New human systems that incentivize and promote culture change are the focus of 32 recommendations in 6 groups. Culture change will be important to enable hundreds of separate USGS research projects to produce FAIR products. A group of 11 recommendations will improve the exchange of knowledge to encourage FAIR. For example, we are asking leadership to speak about the value of FAIR and recommending incorporation of FAIR principles in USGS training curricula. Interoperability and reuse of data often depends on the data producers using consistent research methods. 6 recommendations will provide information to encourage and enable research projects to use standard methods. Consistent interoperable products across the agency will be enabled by the clear guidance of policy. 6 recommendations ask for review and updating of USGS data production policies to provide guidance for FAIR data maturity. We recommend that USGS provide incentives to employees, such as performance awards and promotions, to encourage adoption of FAIR practices, and also to support employees in research, development, and participation in professional communities to stay current with new FAIR ways. And finally, there's our recommendation to use the FAIR data maturity model to monitor how well USGS is doing. And I'd like to thank this RDA group for inventing that wheel for us. Next slide. USGS is working on the organizational changes that are needed to enable our diverse and distributed data production system to join the 21st century by producing fair products. This is going to be a big challenge. Thank you for creating the Fair Data Maturity Model so that we will be able to define our goal and evaluate our progress.
Thanks, Fran. That was fantastic. Viv, do you want to add anything?
Oh no, there's nothing to add. That was very well done, Fran. Thank you.
All right, so I know that I'm asking a dangerous question and you can defer this, but based on where we are with the roadmap development, do you have a sense for when we'll have a public version that we can share? And no is okay. I realize I'm putting you on the spot.
I can try to answer that. It's a bit of a process to get things published in the USGS, but I think we're quite close to being able to start that process. So I don't know. I think maybe in the next 6 months would be a reasonable thing to say. What about you, Fran? Is that
I hope so.
off or yeah?
That seems pretty fair. It would be really fantastic to have you come back to present for us once you're ready. This is really exciting. Okay, fantastic. Thank you both. All right, we now transition over to the National Institutes of Health, and we have with Gregorick, who is, I think within the last year, now in a brand new office for data science and really making incredible happen within NIH, and has a really exciting publication that just came out in the last month. So Susan, I will let you take it away.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay, Shelley?
Yes.
Awesome. This is a wonderful panel. Such exciting and new activities happening in FAIR data. I think that, oh, okay. And I'm really pleased to be here. I am the Associate Director for Data Science. And as Shelley said, I'm within a new office, the Office of Data Science Strategy, within the Office of the Director. Next slide. I think we can all agree that we do want to get to having our research data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the question is, what does that look like, and is that the goal? And I propose that, in fact, that is not the end goal, but the next slide will illustrate that it's really just the beginning. This is the starting point for where we can launch really exciting and new data science activities across all of our federal agencies and within the community. And I think that today we are really just right here where this image illustrates. We're at the starting point. We're making a lot of progress, and we have some ways to go. Next slide. NIH, as you can imagine, and as many agencies can also attest, supports a wide variety of different and diverse data sets, everything from structural biology, as you see in the upper left, this is a cryo-EM image, to the images of brain and the brain connectome, to images of live cells and fluorescence, to clinical studies, behavioral studies, and social and economic studies. So all of this data represents a mountain of work, and the communities that produce and use this data are vastly different and have different expectations about data maturity, data sharing, and metadata. And so, next slide. Sometimes it feels like we are in a sea of data, as this image of the rhyme of the ancient mariner suggests. And I like what John Quackenbush says. It's not necessarily a big data problem, it's a messy data problem. And for biology, this is absolutely the case, and particularly illustrated as we work together at NIH to address the COVID-19 pandemic. We are finding that there is a lot of work that we have to do in order to get the data to the researchers in a format that they can use in the many multimodal ways that researchers would like to use data. Next slide. So I think this is the most important slide that I'm going to show you today. So I'm going to spend the most time on this particular element. And as Shelley noted, NIH has released our policy for data management and sharing, and it's linked here. This policy was released right in time for Halloween here in the US, but it doesn't go into effect for our extramural research community until January 25th of 2023. So there's plenty of time to prepare. The policy in 3 short bullets essentially requires all NIH-supported researchers, whether you're an extramural researcher or you're an intramural researcher, to prospectively plan for how you will manage the scientific data that will be generated in your laboratory, how you will preserve that data, and how you will share that data. You will do this by creating a data management and sharing plan. The submission of these plans will outline, again, how you intend to manage your scientific data and the accompanying metadata. We certainly know that not all data will be shared into an open data platform, but when it isn't, we would like you to tell us why not, and if there are any restrictions or limitations on data sharing, we would like to know that. The plan will be part of the budget justification of your application, so it will be seen by your reviewers in the study sections, but it will not necessarily be scored. The evaluation of the plan will lie both with NIH and your program directors. This policy is for all researchers. However, there is some restrictions. The training programs, the infrastructure programs, applicants will not necessarily need to develop a data management sharing plan for those awards. There are 2 additional caveats that I would like to say. First, that you can submit allowable cost for the data management in your lab. That includes curation. Oh, some things are happening.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Let me see.
That's okay. I can speed up.
No, it's okay. Let me see if I can go back. I was like, my P previous wasn't working. Apologies. There you go.
No problem. You can go to the next slide.
No need to speed up, Susan. You're okay.
Okay.
I'm flunking my one job here.
Yeah, that's fine. You can go to the next slide. All right. So the allowable cost, you can submit costs for the management of your data within your grant application and within your budget section, obviously. And that can be for the curation of your data and the funding that you will find necessary to get the data into a repository. What we really want to see is data shared within either community repositories that support that data or in generalist repositories that support wide-ranging data sharing. For me, I'm seeing, I think, a Slack channel. I don't know if it's possible to go back to the slides.
Anthony's trying to let us know he's having a hard time advancing.
We
got it.
Okay.
I'm totally flunking this job. Apologies.
No problem.
Okay, am I on the right slide, Susan?
If the slides will be made available to the community, that's okay. I think the second element, if you can go back one, maybe I could talk about the second element after cost. Hopefully
Mary,
I won't mess with.
Can you do it? My P button's not working. I don't know how to get back.
It's okay. We can go on.
So sorry,
Sorry,
Susan.
yeah.
No,
I can't do it
no
for
problem.
you since it's on your computer.
I could.
That's okay. Perhaps what I can illustrate is that we absolutely want to support data management and data sharing, but we need to give you the tools so that you can actually do this effectively. And so one of the things that we stood up before this policy came out, but knowing that it would come out, was funding opportunities to support community repositories. These are repositories that have significant scientific impact in the communities that they serve. I'll give you an example from my research days, was the Protein Data Bank. They have significant community engagement, including outreach and training, and also engagement with the journals that data does appear in. What we would really like to see is a strong link between the repositories and knowledge bases and the journals which are holding those publications, that there's an assessment of the quality of the data. So again, bringing in this idea of a data maturity model, as well as an efficiency of operation, and then a governance board that helps decision-making processes and makes sure that these repositories and knowledge bases are really adhering to what the community wishes. And one thing you're going to notice right away is that there's separate funding for repositories and knowledge bases, and I know this has some consternation in the research community, but for NIH, we want to make sure that we are supporting the core data necessary for research in a sustainable fashion. The slides disappeared. Okay, here we go. Okay. So we can go to the slide, I think it's 53 on your master slide deck.
Susan, you're such a good sport. We just did a presenter switch.
No problem. No
All right, how's that look for you? Shall I progress?
Yeah, go ahead and progress 2 slides forward. Once I was given a talk and the internet died on my end, so that was a fun experience.
Oh my God.
Okay, so this is the second.
In this case, the P button died. Go ahead.
This is the second most important thing I'm going to tell you, is that recently the Office of Science and Technology Policy, in collaboration with agencies, federal agencies, including NIH, put out a notice on desired characteristics for data repositories. It's really important to have a look at these desired characteristics. I think they match pretty well with what I've seen in the EU presented earlier by Carlos. But the idea is why we are doing this across all agencies is to make sure that we're consistent in our language about the expectation for fair data, that the characteristics are well understood across agencies, because we want to make sure that researchers and data repositories and knowledge bases can support data management in a consistent, coherent way, and that we can evaluate those data management plans consistently across agencies. And it's important for NIH. We are 27 very distinct institutes and centers. And if you can imagine having a data management sharing policy that goes across all of those 27 institutes and centers, consistency is key to helping promote fair data and fair data sharing. The next slide will give you a really high-level overview of those characteristics. And there's a number of them. These are characteristics for all data repositories. There's a subset for data repositories that hold human data, but for all data repositories, you're going to see some very consistent themes of persistent identifiers, plans for long-term sustainability up front. Importantly, metadata that accompanies the data. Remember, metadata is the love letter to our future research cells. We want to make it very usable for the future. Mechanisms for curation and quality assurance. Ways to access the data in an easy and broad way, broad measures for reuse, clear guidance on how you're going to develop metrics and measures for your repository. And this is something that we are actually really thinking about at NIH. Documented security assurances and data integrity, confidentiality requirements, common format, common data elements, common data models, provenance, and finally, your policies for data retention. The next slide is just a little bit deeper dive. If you happen to have a repository that holds human subjects data, there is a certain additional requirements, including fidelity, compliance. How are you going to measure compliance with data use restrictions, ensuring participant privacy? What do you do if there's a security or a data breach? Your ways in which controlling for downloads so important as we put many things into the cloud. How are we going to audit for downloads? How do you address terms of use violations? And finally, how are requests for data being processed? So the next slide, we'll do a little bit deeper dive into some of the things that we're thinking about at NIH that match the data maturity model in terms of data life cycles. And there's a click here because it's an animation. We've been doing a lot of work. You just click through on stage 2, thinking about data repositories and the maturity models of the data and the repository. How can we assess and help researchers with the acquiring the data, curating the data, aggregating the data in a federated process, accessing the data across many systems, and then as it's been mentioned, how do you analyze data that has differential user use agreements or differential privacy concerns? These are not easy questions, and it's only been elucidated how hard this problem is when we try to do this for COVID data. The next slide will show you, and I'm going to give full credit here to Dr. Kim Pruitt at NCBI for developing this data resource lifecycle. And you can see this is developed particularly for NCBI, but we are looking at it across NIH in terms of data preservation through the introduction and the growth phase to when it's mature, retaining customers, staying competitive, having data that really serves the needs of the researchers. And eventually, as you know, it's all technologies who generate data tend to phase into a declination stage for the most part, and new technologies take up. And so sometimes that data becomes outdated. Microarrays is a perfect example. People probably still use it, but there are new technologies in RNA-seq that people now use, and so that data may replace some of the older microarray data. And there's eventually a decision point, and that's the tough part for federal agencies is, do we stay or do we go? And that's also what we're thinking of. And so we've, the next slide will show you some of the workshops that we've had to address some of these issues, and we are thinking about it and thinking about how we can support those characteristics to get our data repositories to that happy space of maturity through our trustworthy workshops, and thank you for all who attended and co-chairs, and to our data metrics workshop for the best practices for use of metrics and understanding data. These workshops have produced 2 excellent reports. They are now being digested by NIH leadership, and our steps and next steps forward will be discussed probably in the February timeframe, I'm thinking. And that is the last slide, except for the last vision slide, which is that, if you just went, there we go. That I think we've made progress collectively through our research communities and at NIH. We've made progress, but we have a really long ways to go, and it's a fun journey, and I'm really happy to be a part of the journey. And with that, I'll close and pass the ball to the next panelist.
Susan, I've got one question, or maybe just statement, just really highlighting team members from NIH that were integral in the trust principle development, and that really benefit. I mean, having your participation was really valuable in that work. So NIH is incredibly engaged at RDA.
Thank you so much, and I'm going to give a special shout out to Dr. Dawei Lin, who I think provided NIH with real clarity and vision on trust and trustworthy principles, and that would not go as far if it weren't for him, and we're so happy to be a part of RDA in all the ways that we can.
Thank you. This was fantastic. I'm excited at what's happening at NIH. This is great. And there's our closing slide. And coming up, so Dr. Martin Halbert, he is National Science Foundation's Senior Advisor for Public Access, and I'd just like to call out that he's also my program officer, so thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. He is working on some really significant efforts around expanding the public access repository, as well as the implementation of the management effective practices, and I'm very delighted that you're here. Thank you so much.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me to speak to the workshop. This is a great workshop. I really appreciate the information exchange. Let me tell you a little bit about the current NSF activities in the public access program that I'm the director for. Go ahead and advance the slide. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to try to be very prompt. Just going to give you a little bit of context and rationale for our program, our current activities in the current NSF repository system, some funding opportunities that my program provides, and then some next steps that we're planning. Next slide. So there we go. For the benefit of our European colleagues, just a little bit of context. The NSF, the U.S. National Science Foundation, has required data management plans since 2011, but much of our current work was sort of started, catalyzed by this memorandum from Dr. John P. Holdren in 2013, which directed U.S. agencies that issued more than $100 million in awards per year to develop a plan to support increased public access to the results of research funded by the federal government, and in particular, provide public access to peer-reviewed publications and digital data. This memorandum from Dr. Holdren was the director under the Obama administration of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And it was very catalytic in the United States, especially in federal agencies, for starting up new responses to public access and what now very much aligns with the FAIR principles. Next slide. Within the National Science Foundation, this plan that was issued by Dr. Francis Cordova with report leadership by Amy Friedlander and many others within the National Science Foundation came out in 2015. And it has largely summarized and directed the approaches to public access and providing public access by the National Science Foundation to the extensive results of research. The foundation funds almost $8 billion US per year in the form of roughly 50,000 awards per year on an annual basis, and it produces a great deal of research, to say the least. While much of this plan has now been accomplished, and we are actually looking forward to a second or a follow-on plan that would describe where we're going, there are still some significant aspects that are yet to be accomplished that we're working on right now. So that's what I'm going to tell you about. Next slide, please. And while it's coming up, there we go. The current system, current NSF Public Access Repository, PAR, what we now call PAR version 1.0, focuses on peer-reviewed articles. It allows, and has allowed for a number of years now, researchers to deposit versions of their juried articles in the repository for public access, whether it's the last accepted version of the article or the published version. And it especially and increasingly focuses on the importance of DOIs and other persistent identifiers as a means of identifying and providing access to quality metadata for the articles. The system indexes them and actually also has various kinds of interactions with the main NSF award search systems that synchronize the two parts of the infrastructure in sort of interesting ways to track. The PAR system currently does not accept references or submissions of data, and that's the main thing we're working on right now that I'm going to talk about momentarily. Next slide, please. And before I talk about the PAR 2.0 system, I do want to highlight, or Shelley invited me to highlight, some of the solicitations that we currently have open in the public access program around advancing principles of access to data and open science that I think are very synergistic with the FAIR principles. The first one is around effective practices for data, and has funded a variety of research in persistent identifiers and especially the notion of machine readable data management plans, a new perspective area that we're very interested in as we look at where do we want to go next with DMPs. The second solicitation is around open science practices for research data and just how we can best make use of openly accessible and data, especially that is made accessible through FAIR principles. Next slide, please. The other thing I want to call out here that has been, I think, very catalytic in the last year or so are some synergistic alignment efforts between various U.S. federal agencies. This is in the context of the National Science and Technology Council, NSTC, Subcommittee on Open Science, or SOS, which have drafted a variety of documents this year and are continuing to draft them that are basically producing a, I would say, fairly strong consensus among U.S. agencies about the directions that we should take in terms of persistent identifiers, repositories, and other systems and aspects that relate to FAIR principles. And I've been very pleased to see this alignment between different agencies. I've really appreciated the discussions in these working groups. Next slide, please. So my concluding slide is just to tell you a little bit about what we're planning right now, what we're working on. This is PAR 2.0, the primary objective of which is to accommodate submissions of research data sets. It's important to understand the reasons why this was a second part of the NSF public access program was, to say the obvious, data is far more complex than articles for submission and repositing. Data sets can range from 20 kilobytes to 20 petabytes. And as we have examined this, discussed this, we are not going to require that data sets be deposited in PAR 2.0, but rather rely on what we think will be a more flexible system of requiring that data be deposited in trusted repositories that demonstrate FAIR best practices, such the obvious things such as maintaining sustainable long-term access to the assignment of persistent identifiers. I was very appreciative of Carlos's presentation earlier. Perhaps not surprisingly, the thinking between the European Commission and the National Science Foundation in the US is very similar. Makes sense, all of these approaches, and I'd love to compare notes and coordinate with you on some of the practices, I'll say. We are now planning these upgrades to the NSF PAR infrastructure to address the additional functional needs and hope to accomplish most, if not all, of the development efforts in calendar 21. So with that, I will wrap up and go to Q&A, and I hope I gave you a couple minutes back, Shelley.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Let me stop sharing for a moment. There's a delay, of course. There we go. Okay, sorry. Am I still sharing my screen, or can you hear yourselves now? Oh, there we go. All right. Fantastic. I wasn't watching the Q&A, but I can see now it's filling up. So if you've got any questions, if you could go ahead and put them in the Q&A, that would be fantastic, and then we can start to work through those.
Yes, so I have been keeping an eye on Q&A, and it's great to see the questions come in. And I find it interesting, a number of questions to a number of different speakers around the trusted repository and what that looks like and what the views are on that. So first of all, I think probably Carlos, the question was first directed at Carlos, and Carlos has answered in the chat, but even in the question box. But the question was more broadly, how will you select trusted repositories? So Carlos, if you'd like to respond to that, first of all, then we can also see for other speakers what trusted repositories means.
So sure, and I understand that this is something that might raise some concerns because it's not something that we can rely on previous work to say, well, this is exactly what a trusted repository is going to look like. We're learning here as we go on. And I think that to calm some of the fears that communities might have, in commission policies, we've always gone for incremental steps. So we're not going to be in a situation where we radically change the playing field. This being said, trusted repositories are, as I said, something that will give us a good idea, a good proxy for the level of fairness. And for this, we will be requiring, I think that in line with many of the discussions that have taken place in this webinar, with some really concrete, specific technical requirements, basic requirements, such as the provision of PIDs or a certain level of metadata. And from our side, this discussion is currently ongoing. We have a look at different sources for inspiration. A big source of inspiration, of course, is the work that is being done by Fair's Fair with respect to the trust principles. But this is an ongoing discussion. So I'm very appreciative of what Martin said in his presentation, and I, of course, would be very glad to have further discussions and share notes. And this is what this webinar is all about. So we're more than happy to engage.
Thanks, Carlos. And this question was raised to Susan around, so NIH RFC mentions certification of repositories. Do you see certification as a way forward to assess compliance with those characteristics?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. And we are certainly supportive of the Core Trust Seal, for example, as a way to develop a little bit hardening in your data repositories. I think that in terms of assessing trustworthiness for NIH, it's still quite early, and it may be something that we handle both through peer review of those repositories that are coming through the FOA that I mentioned, and through the community assessment through Core Trust Seal, for example. So we absolutely do support, but we do not require that folks go through Core Trust Seal, but we are very supportive when repositories wish to go through those certification processes. And I think that they're community vetted, and that's probably the best way for us to further harden the idea of trustworthiness.
Keith, could I jump in just a second? Viv, can you talk about, could you talk about USGS and their implementation of Core Trust Seal? You had a really interesting.
Yeah, sure, Shelley, thanks. The U.S. Geological Survey, which is part of the Department of the Interior in the United States, we took a path that was sort of a stepping stone, I guess I would say. And that is, we had a lot of numerous places in which we were already storing data. And so we established a program within the Bureau to use the Core Trust Seal requirements for trusted digital repositories. And we literally made a little process where you would actually apply to an internal committee to the USGS for them to analyze your system based on Core Trust Seal requirements. And so we haven't gone on to the international stage yet in terms of that, but we have a process right now in which we have several what we call trusted digital repositories within the USGS. We've identified those. So it's sort of a stepping stone, but it allows a process to, develop, I guess. So thanks.
Keith, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I would just like to make a comment to add basically on what was said, that the community input is very important for us. And for example, in many cases, yes, we would like to have those characteristics like Susan, for example, mentioned, or certification, perhaps Core Trust Seal or other. But we are also looking at communities themselves providing good practices. So, for example, we have the Elixir infrastructure in Europe, and they go through a very detailed process of vetting core data resources and deposition databases. So then we can be fairly sure that these are community accepted and trustworthy resources. And then we plan to have not an extensive list, but perhaps as examples, so we can be able to say life sciences grantees can use these resources, and the equivalent in many other cases. So I think this can be complementary to whatever certification or characteristics we choose.
maybe I'd like to come in. It's Edith.
Yep, come in. Let's go for it, Edith.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really inspirational for me to listen to all the presentation and to see how the fair is started its own life. And I think that we will be very proud to create this kilometer zero with the fair maturity criteria. I have one small comment and two questions, if I may. One that I like to thank for a friend that she mentioned that all the four letters are critically important. Yeah, we have seen in our work that how much effort goes to F and maybe to A, and how much the interoperability and the reuse is a kind of lagging behind. And I like to underline that just polishing the letter F or letter A, it doesn't help. We wish to move and we wish to promote the idea that all the letters are equally important, and we shouldn't forget the other four. And my one question is connected to that. I think that the last two letters are very much supporting the interdisciplinarity. Yeah, when we have a different data. So maybe I'd like to ask a question that how do you see this problem? And my second question, I was so happy again to see that it's also about cultural change. That is it more a bottom-up cultural change, or are your leaders are taking it seriously? They are speaking about it, or how this cultural change is led by? Who is the leading body or community? Thank you. Maybe I have to add that we in Europe, we have probably the problem that one of the biggest obstacles are the organizations themselves. Their very conservative operational mode is the obstacle. It's a bigger obstacle than the legislation or the community approach. So time to time, the organizations are the bottleneck. So this is why I'm interested on this cultural change. Thank you.
Viv, do you want to take that first?
Sure, I can say something about that. We've actually approached the whole culture change from both directions, the top down as well as the bottom up, and both are extremely important. So the top down is more about establishing the policies within our bureau. You know, researchers need to do X, Y, and Z in order to release their data and manage it and that kind of thing. And then, but one of the huge efforts is coming from the bottom up, and that is through what Fran mentioned in her talk, our community for data integration. We have about 1,600 people that participate in that from USGS and from outside as well. It's an open community. But we use that community to be able to figure out how to implement the policies, you know, what are the best practices. That's how we get the buy-in from the researchers and from the data managers and so forth that are in the organization. So it's been hugely effective. We established the CDI about 10 years ago, and our policies on data management about 5 years ago. So we've seen a huge difference. We have thousands of data releases now in our repositories. One in particular I know receives about 1,000 a year, just data releases, and that can include multiple data sets within that release as a package. So the culture change is happening. It's going to take a while though. There's still tweaks and things to work on. So, but that's how we approach it.
Thank you.
Susan, I think you have something to add to that.
Absolutely, yes. You hit it at exactly some of the hardest problems that we're working on right now. We've been spending quite a bit of time on findable and accessible, and we've made good progress, but interoperability is really a hard challenge. We've come together at NIH, and I think it's both a bottom-up approach through the actual research communities who are doing this work, and the leadership at NIH who are trying to understand the impact of this work, to meet in the middle. We have, for the past year, a fairly large working group for NIH cloud-based platform interoperability, and these are platforms that serve data to communities, specifically in genomics communities, or the TopMed Biodata Catalyst communities, or the Cancer Commons research communities, or even Kids First, the Gabrielle Miller Kids First communities. Each of these have really important platforms that serve data to their researchers. Interoperability amongst these platforms and amongst the data is a challenge. We have been working for a year on this. We've made some really good progress in terms of being able to search across the platforms so that researchers can find the data across the platforms. It's still pretty early pilot days. And then take those data into an aggregated set and do analysis and workflows on those data. I think that, and this is probably something that's happening in the European Union as well, through maybe the open European open cloud infrastructure, but we have a long ways to go, and just even be able to get the data to work together in a sort of an interoperable or harmonized way. So we're right at the tip of that big iceberg, and I think it's an exciting time, but a challenging time.
Thank you, Susan. And we are coming to the very end of the webinar, but if Martin would like to jump in on that topic as well, that would be great.
I'll be brief. That was an excellent question, Edith. You know, especially on the interoperability front, I would echo the comments of the others. Like many of the other funding agencies that we're speaking, NSF has created a COVID-19 Information Commons, a big database of the hundreds of rapid response awards that we funded in the area of COVID research. But the key question that's come up is, how do you compare and achieve interoperability on data between data sets that are created in these, you know, disparate, you know, projects? And I think that is a key topic for research in coming months and years. I'm particularly interested in the concept, the emerging concept of PID graphs, in other words, persistent identifier graphs that potentially at least offer a mechanism for machine automated searches and comparison and interoperation. But it's very much a prospective area that I think is before us right now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. So very exciting questions. Still more that have been sent over to us, but we are at the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for participating. This has been incredibly interesting, and maybe asking RDA US if they would be interested in possibly in a webinar series going forward that we could all work together on. That would be really fantastic. There's a lot of opportunity to collaborate. And to my working group co-chairs, Edith and Keith, thank you so much. Thanks for supporting this crazy time. Keith is in the middle of the night right now, so many thanks to that. And the RDA Secretariat for hosting us. And I realize we have working groups with this, we've effort with these working groups that they're normally more communicative on chat, and I realize we had you all locked down, and I apologize for that. We'll try to make it more open so you can communicate with each other on the next session. I know that was a little frustrating for some of you who like to talk to each other behind the scenes. So thank you everyone. Those celebrating Thanksgiving next week, happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.